Okay, welcome back everybody. This lesson is part one of a series on culture. This culture lesson is in 4 parts, and in this lesson we will discuss the concept of culture, outlining several different definitions and aspects of culture. So we'll look at a few different ways to describe it, and then features of culture, of which there are many. For example, what does culture include? Is it just the type of thing you would study in a museum exhibit, like art, music, or traditional costumes? What about cuisine or housing types? We try to break down all of these elements and understand culture as a system in this lesson. So culture isn't necessarily the material aspects of what we see when we study other people. There is much more to culture. And in this series on culture, I look at a few different tools we can use to analyze and identify different aspects of culture. So in this lesson, we are going to look at bullet point 1, what is culture? This 4-part series of lessons on culture is basically outlined here. So in part 1, we're going to look at what is culture. In part 2, we're going to see how culture is learned, symbolic, and shared. In part 4, we're going to look at the barrel model of culture, which is one of those tools I mentioned in the previous slide. The barrel model will come in handy when you're writing your midterm and final in this class, and it just helps you in general learn about each of the cultures we're going to look at this semester. And then in part 4, we look at additional terms, including ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. So what is culture? What is culture and why do we study it? What is the relation between culture and the individual? And how does culture change, especially with globalization? Those are some things we're going to think about in this lesson and throughout the semester. So one definition of culture is that it is knowledge and behaviors that vary among societies and are handed down through the generations. So here I identify culture as the things we know and the things that we do. Another aspect that isn't on this slide is the relationships that we have. So for example, in this picture, this could be a mother and daughter. What is motherhood like? Or what are our social roles like? Those are kind of encapsulated in knowledge and behaviors, but think about the relationships between people as well and how those can vary across cultures. For example, what are marriage practices like, or what are marriages like across different cultures? That would kind of be lumped in with knowledge and behaviors, but sometimes I like to include relationships as well. Some other 3 things you need to remember about culture are that it is dynamic and shared and learned. So dynamic means that it can change. Shared means that it has to be transmitted between individuals. And of course learned, meaning you're not born with it. And I'll talk about each of these features in the next few slides. So it's dynamic. It's ever-changing. And also keep in mind that it's a system. So in a system, if you change one aspect of the system, it could kind of snowball or affect, kind of like maybe the butterfly effect, other aspects of a culture. So in the video we're watching, you're probably watching this week, you're going to see a society that's impacted by resettlement and interactions with a different society, and how that changes many aspects of their society for the worst. So in this slide, we're going to look at an early definition of culture by the British anthropologist Sir Edward Tyler, who was one of the first anthropologists to kind of isolate culture as a concept and examine it. He argued that it can be studied, culture can be studied scientifically. His definition is that culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So here you can see where he says acquired. That comes into play with our shared and learned aspect. We learn culture usually from another person that we're sharing it with, right? So Sir Edward Tyler's definition focused on attributes that people acquire through learning rather than inherit biologically. So we're not talking about instincts, we're talking about things that we learn through our lifetime. Another anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, described cultures as sets of control mechanisms, like plans, recipes, rules, instructions, and likens them to computer programs that govern human behavior. One example of this could be how you behave at dinner time, if you're going to dinner, if you're going on a date. We have sets of instructions that we follow usually when we're trying to behave ourselves in society. So Geertz's example of culture as instructions and rules, dinner time or dating, a dinner date could be good examples of that. Another anthropologist, Leslie White, defined culture as dependent on symboling. Culture consists of tools, implements, utensils, clothing, ornaments, customs, institutions, beliefs, rituals, games, works of art, language, etc. So all of these things that people construct that have other meanings also kind of encapsulate or define culture. Yet another anthropologist, Kenneth Guest, defined culture as a system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behavior, artifacts, and institutions that are created, shared, learned, and contested by a group of people. Now, Guest includes more behavior and institutions, and he includes contested, so that contrasts with my earlier, simpler definition. Institutions could include the example I provided earlier, like marriage, the institution of marriage, or any other societal structures that we have within groups of people, like leadership, even religion could be seen as an institution. And it also says contested, so just because a culture has a shared kind of group of knowledge, beliefs, and patterns of behavior doesn't mean that everyone in that society practices those things. Our aspects of culture are often up for debate. So, however you define it, culture is a complex and dynamic system. Different anthropologists will have differing ways to define it and different schools of thought on how to study it. So that's important to remember. Later on in this series on culture, I talk about the barrel model. It is just one way of looking at culture, and I personally find that it's an easy teaching tool for my students, but it's not necessarily the only way to look at culture. And that concludes this segment on culture. Please proceed to culture part 2.